Welcome to another episode of the Left of Lansing podcast with Pat Johnston. A progressive insight into Michigan's political and cultural world. And of course, an entertaining podcast designed to shine a light on how to make Michigan's political machine work for the people. Now, from the Left of Lansing headquarters, located in his attic, here's the award-winning Pat Johnston.
Oh, yeah! Welcome to another edition of Michigan's premier progressive podcast. I am Pat Johnston, and I have to hand it to Arkansas MAGA Republican Governor Sarah Huckabee-Sanders. You'd think by now, MAGA White Christian Nationalist Republican nutjobs would have gotten it through their thick heads that attacking women who don't have children isn't perhaps the smartest political move. But no, as we've seen how Dear Leader's Wonderboy Tech Bro running mate J.B. Vance's childless cat lady remark destroyed any of their hopes to make a dent in the Harris-Walz significant lead amongst the women's vote, in walks Sarah Huckabee-Sanders, who decides to just keep doubling down and keep illustrating for the entire country just how weird and downright angry their side truly is when it comes to those who have not had children.
So my kids keep me humble. Unfortunately, Kamala Harris doesn't have anything keeping her humble.
That was Huckabee-Sanders speaking at a town hall event in Flint, Michigan earlier this week. Now, she served as Dear Leader's press secretary back during his regime and got to relive those so-called glory days by hosting the event where she got to ask her former boss, quote-unquote, questions. But while making some remarks before the question-answer period, Huckabee-Sanders, who flew up to Michigan because Dear Leader apparently didn't want walking disasters such as Tudor Dixon doing this job, once again reiterated a belief in the White Christian Nationalist MAGA mindset. If you're a woman, your only value to society is to breed children. I mean, that's what her little so-called attack there on Vice President Kamala Harris was all about. To which I say, screw you, Sarah. Really? Screw you. Go back to Arkansas where you can show how much that you really value children when you signed a child labor law bill so that businesses can hire 14 and 15-year-olds since they've got a labor shortage down there. Oh, that is so family-friendly. You really care about the kids. And while you're at it, tell us how you're so pro-family and so pro-life, despite the fact that the number of black women in Arkansas who died during childbirth or within a year of giving birth rose 110% from 1999 to 2019, according to the Journal of American Medical Association. So again, Sarah, go screw yourself. Don't tell Michiganders how to live their lives. Don't tell the country how to live their lives. I mean, really, what is going on in your head to think that people want to listen to you tell them what is freedom and what is not? Go back to your failed state and leave Michigan alone. You see, here we Michiganders believe in the freedom of women to make their own choices, whether it be their careers or when it comes down to their decisions on whether or not or when or if to have kids or not have kids. I mean, I thought you people were all about freedom. No, you're about dominating women. That's what you're all about. That's why we want to protect women against people like you, against the White Christian Nationalist MAGA Republican movement that believes in more freedom for the gun than for a woman's bodily health. That's why we Michigan Democrats and Democratic Governor Gretchen Whitmer passed bills deleting Michigan MAGA Republican trap laws that were designed to make it more difficult for women to receive care. That's why Democratic senators in Michigan have introduced bills requiring Medicaid and private insurers to cover over-the-counter contraception and emergency contraception. We're trying to become the seventh state to give women that kind of access to freedom, that kind of access to their own choice. Because you see, we're not weird here. We believe in women having the right to control their healthcare decisions. And good job there by Michigan Senate Democrats Jeff Irwin from Ann Arbor and Sarah Kavanaugh from my hometown of Redford Township for proposing such progressive yet common sense bills. So screw you, Sarah Huckabee-Sanders for once again joining the MAGA cult and belittling women who don't have biological kids like Kamala Harris and the millions of other women across the country like her. Oh, and by the way, good job belittling those women who want to have children but cannot. And good job on MAGA Republicans in the U.S. Senate this week on blocking yet another bill that would have guaranteed the right to in vitro fertilization. Oh, good job. Yes, you guys are all about IVF. I mean, that's what I'm told. Yet over and over and over again, you guys vote against IVF bills. The AP reports the bill would establish a nationwide right for patients to access IVF and other assisted reproductive technologies and a right for doctors and insurance companies to provide it. An effort to preempt state efforts to limit the services. It would also require more health insurers to cover it and expand coverage for military service members and veterans. Why, Republicans? Why are you against the military? Why? Explain it, please. I want to know. You guys say you're always pro-military, yet you're blocking military service members and veterans from having that nationwide right to access IVF. You see, it's all about controlling women and controlling their reproductive health decisions. Pro-life Republicans, give me a break. There's no such thing. It's all about controlling women's health decisions, which fits right in with the White Christian Nationalist belief system. And this happened just after their dear leader announced last week how he wants to require private insurance companies to cover IVF treatments since he's apparently pro-fertilization, which, frankly, hearing that phrase leave his mouth makes me utterly ill. So MAGA Republicans just simply despise the fact that women have say over their bodies and their health decisions, and they say that they're the party of freedom? Really? And meanwhile, while forcing women to have kids in the ways that they want them to have kids, they at the same time offer no help in terms of childcare, paid sick leave, or helping the mother during and after pregnancy. I mean, maybe they do, but perhaps those plans are in their concept phase. Thanks for listening to another episode of Left of Lansing. Please follow Left of Lansing on Twitter, Facebook, and the Gram. Subscribe to the podcast wherever you listen, and subscribe to the show on YouTube. That's right. That's at Left of Lansing, so you can follow me there as well. Subscribe so that way you can follow Michigan's premier progressive podcast in a number of places. Stopping the warped, weird MAGA Republican cult is a full-time job, as many, many of you out there know, and let this podcast just be one way to help strong, progressive, common-sense values lead the way towards freedom and prosperity in the Mitten State. And then, once everyone sees how progressive values and leadership helped turn around Michigan after 40 years of Republican rule, it'll then galvanize other Democrats across the country to do the same. And that is what this podcast is all about. But, as I've always said, it starts on the state and local level first, which is why I talk to so many progressives running for state office or leading the charge on the activist level, because they're fighting to not only block MAGA's destructive and chaotic politics, but they're fighting to help people for the common good across the state. That's what this is all about, and that's why, if you recall, I complained at the beginning of last week's show about how I couldn't pick up an Elissa Slotkin for the U.S. Senate sign for my front yard because the Gratiot County Democratic Party didn't have any signs. I mean, the hardworking volunteers there said that they asked the Michigan Democratic Party for signs and heard zip back from the party. And that's not good, because we need to give Elissa Slotkin as much exposure as possible to help her win such a vital Senate seat if Democrats hope to keep the U.S. Senate blue. I mean, we can't have Florida Mike Rogers taking Debbie Stabenow's seat. We just can't. But we need help in trying to give her some exposure, especially in rural areas. But we all need signs also all across Michigan for Elissa Slotkin. Trust me, those help. We can't be giving up on rural voters, and many of whom probably feel alienated since Democrats aren't reaching out to them. And that's why I would like to read this email that I received from a loyal listener who echoed some similar sentiments up from the UP. He listened to my show last week when I complained about not being able to find an Elissa Slotkin sign, and this is what they said, and I'm going to read it for you. Greetings. I work on Kelly Van Ginhoven's campaign here in Delta County. You know the history since Kelly's been on your show. I thought it brought some recognition to the Upper Peninsula and Delta County, but we still feel invisible at times, especially now since we have not received one Harris Walz sign. Yesterday, some people had an arts and crafts day making signs. WTF, seriously? Can you help shine some light on our dilemma? The UP and Delta County matter. So many Trump signs make this county look defeated. Love your podcast. Thanks for your time, Keith. And Keith, thanks so much for your email, and thanks for everything that you're doing up there to help bring sanity back to Delta County. And thanks for helping out on Kelly's campaign up there. And let me just say once again, Kelly absolutely rocks. But Keith is correct in feeling a little invisible at times as a Democrat in a rural county. We shouldn't be relying on local arts and crafts experts to make Harris Walz signs, let alone Slotkin signs. Don't get me wrong, that's great. I'm glad that people are picking up the mantle where, maybe the party is falling short. But come on, Michigan Democrats, get some signs out to the rural areas across the state. Every single vote counts. Every single district counts. Every single precinct counts, especially for this election. Fight for everyone's vote in every place. Don't cede ground to MAGA. Come on, what is my tagline at the end of each episode? Take the battle to them. Democrats, it's up to you to follow through on that promise because, as we've seen in Michigan, while it's not perfect at times, the Democratic majority in Lansing has really made some significant and positive changes during the last year and a half. For example, Democratic senators this week passed a State House K-12 education bill which permanently eliminates the 3% tax on some public school teachers' pay into a healthcare fund for retirement and freed up then $670 million to be redirected to school districts all across the state. Now, Republicans, of course, voted against the bill, even though the healthcare fund is more than fully funded. To them, that's not the whole goal. No, they don't care. To them, it's about hurting public schools. And how do you hurt public schools? You cut their funding, and you do it any way possible. To them, it's all about hurting public schools. As we know, rich billionaire donors like the DeVos family here in the state have spent their riches and their time on finding ways to divert taxpayer funds from public schools to private schools. Actually, it's been a lifelong crusade for DeVos and their cadre of billionaire right-wing donors to destroy public schools, all in the name of so-called education freedom. And they've tried to do it through a voucher scheme that's led to absolute failure on multiple levels. Now, Betsy DeVos tried to pass a school voucher scheme here in Michigan years ago, but voters soundly defeated that scheme. They saw right through it. However, the voucher scheme experienced some victories in a number of states, which is the goal of the voucher scheme, to dismantle public schools on a state-by-state basis. And with the Heritage Foundation's Project 2025, we know dismantling the Department of Education and funneling money from public to private schools is one of the project's top priorities. We know that. It's written right there. It's been in the work, though, for decades, and the voucher scheme has not only hurt school districts across the country, but it hurts those communities as well. I mean, this is a move that got a huge jolt from the Trump administration, and it's a movement that hopes to finish the job by getting dear leader Trump back into the White House. Dr. Josh Cowen is an education policy professor at Michigan State University, and he's been doing lots of writing and research into the harmful effects so-called school choice is causing across the country, and he's released a new book on this whole school voucher scheme, the history behind it, who's behind it, and the ultimate goals of the whole scheme. And the book is called The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. And he's my guest this week, right after this quick break. Oh, by the way, Rich, thanks for all of your diligent work on making leftoflansing.com what it is, what it was, and what it shall be. You're listening to LOL.
You're listening to Left of Lansing. If the podcast isn't enough and you are in need of more Pat, follow him on Twitter and like him on Facebook. Also, don't forget you can read more of his thoughts and hear an archive of past episodes on leftoflansing.com.
Again, the best way to reach me is leftoflansing@gmail.com. I just talked about the lack of Harris and Slotkin signs in certain areas of the state, especially rural areas of the state. And that's because one of our listeners emailed me to say they're experiencing the same issues in their neck of the woods. So the best way to reach me so that we can further the conversation on any topic that I bring up on the show is leftoflansing@gmail.com. All right. The issue of the right-wing school voucher scheme causes lots of conversation and debate across the country. Of course, it's an issue I've covered here many times on the show, but I wanted to bring on an expert to talk about just how influential and wealthy extremists on the right wing have declared war on public schools for years by pushing for so-called school choice vouchers as they drain resources from public schools state by state. So I am thrilled to welcome back such an expert. His name is Dr. Josh Cowen, who's a professor of education policy at Michigan State University. Dr. Cowen has spent years studying and writing about school choice and education politics, and now has a brand new book out titled The Privateers: How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Dr. Cowen, congratulations on the new book, and thanks for coming back here on the show.
Thanks, and thanks for having me back.
So what was the major motivation for you to write a book about this group of right-wing billionaires who joined forces to push this school choice or school voucher scheme across the entire country?
So over the last decade, the vouchers have been around since around 1990 or so, and their historical origins actually trace back to resistance to Brown versus Board of Education, if you can believe that. But vouchers have been around as a modern policy scheme since around 1990, but it's really only been over the last decade that vouchers, as they've gotten larger in states across the country, have caused some of the worst academic declines, student learning loss that we've ever seen on any research question, and really in the history of education research. And yet, here we are, over the last almost 3 years, more than 24 states have passed or expanded voucher schemes, almost exclusively in red states, although in a couple of sort of more purple states as well. And so the central puzzle that the book sets out to ask is, okay, if vouchers have caused this catastrophic learning loss as they've gotten larger, why is it that we are still in this moment talking about the most expansive set of voucher policies across the country? And the answer comes down to the fact that vouchers are tied up in larger cultural war moments, including this big push to make America look more like a Christian nationalist vision for a country. And that's where we are today.
Since you brought it up, I just want to ask you then how this really all hatched, initially. You brought up the Brown v. Board of Education. That's where it really got its first push, right? I mean, it was from some influential conservative thinkers at the time who obviously didn't like that decision. And so this is where they came up with the idea of school choice. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah, well, so the conservative economist Milton Friedman, who would later go on to work closely with both Ronald Reagan in this country and other more conservative, in some cases, far-right leaders in other countries, came up with the idea for vouchers in the months following Brown versus Board. Now, Friedman was writing his voucher idea sort of before the decision was announced, and there's some debate about whether Friedman himself was a segregationist or anything like that, although his essay proposing school vouchers certainly posed it as a solution to this problem as he saw it of forced integration. What isn't in doubt is that segregationists in the 50s, looking for ways to avert the Supreme Court's order in Brown versus Board, immediately latched onto this idea of a voucher system where states could fund a separate private school version of education by just handing parents basically coupons to go attend private school. In fact, in some states, Texas, for example, where I quote in the book from the legislation, I'd never passed there, but the Texas legislation actually would have required parents to sign an affidavit saying they were asking for a voucher specifically due to dislike of racial integration. So there's some pretty nefarious origins to this story from back in the 50s. I will say for completeness that the early voucher schemes in the early 90s were explicitly focused in urban communities. The vast majority of those users were students of color. That's not the case anymore. And again, we're in this different kind of culture war moment now, but it's certainly true that at times these have been proposed by conservatives as kind of a way to deal with very longstanding problems in education.
So then this sort of morphed through years into being a more of a white Christian nationalist kind of a cause. Is that correct? Is that how you'd put it?
There's always been this link to the culture wars and to Christian nationalism. But Christian nationalism has had ebbs and flows in different moments of American history, too. And so the point I'm making today is that we are at this place where, listen, I mean, Christian nationalism and Donald Trump saved the voucher movement in a way, because I really can't overstate just how horrific the results have been over the last 10 years, especially when measuring just basic measures of academic progress like we use to assess public school quality. Vouchers have failed and failed and failed again. And yet here they are, still resurgent more than ever before. And so my argument is, I get a question like this a lot, like, Josh, why are we talking about vouchers today so much? Well, the answer is, why are we talking about book bans today? Why are we talking about, where kids go to the bathroom in public schools today and which locker rooms they use? Why do you have Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, who signed the biggest voucher scheme to date last year, roughly the same time, was on record defending a new public school curriculum that suggested that slavery had economic benefits to enslaved people, and then went and doubled down on it when he was called on it. So we are in this moment where all those things are happening too, and it is not coincidence that vouchers are part of this movement.
And it's not a coincidence then why vouchers are one of the major planks on Project 2025, for instance, right?
Oh, for sure. So 2 of the first 3 paragraphs in the education agenda for Project 2025, right underneath destroying the U.S. Department of Ed, which is the chief anti-discrimination oversight authority in education. So they lead with that. And then the next 2 paragraphs are, let's get vouchers on the table. And then they launch into the usual sort of attacks on woke and what they call gender identity and so on and so forth. But absolutely, vouchers headline the education agenda for Project 2025.
Doctor, you describe in your book how there was this, what word am I looking for? Let's say fusion or a meeting of the minds between billionaire libertarians, such as, let's say, the Koch brothers, and then billionaire religious right families, such as the DeVos family right here in Michigan. How did these 2 groups get connected in the first place, other than money? And where did they see eye to eye when it came to attacking the nation's public school system?
Well, never underestimate the extent to which billionaires will find a billion reasons to break bread together. But as a serious question, what's going on here? So the DeVos family, as we all know here in our state, is very straightforward and upfront about their interest in promoting a deeply kind of what they would call a Christian view of American society. Betsy DeVos has lamented publicly that public schools, in her view, have replaced churches as centers of community and wants churches to come back into centers of community. So when she's not out there talking about passing school vouchers, she's talking about school bathrooms and keeping students in years of student debt. Those 3 issues, vouchers, gender issues, as she calls them, and opposing student debt relief, are kind of the 3 big things that Betsy DeVos talks about these days publicly. Those are very kind of Christian nationalist trends, but you're right. The Koch type billionaires of the world are not interested. You don't see Koch organizations running around talking about woke or talking about where kids go to the bathroom in school. That's not their thing. What they are interested in is extreme, what they call deregulation of government. They see government as the enemy, certainly to business associated with oil and gas and other fossil fuel type industries. They see public schools as, in some sense, the most local and invasive form of government because it is local, it is in communities. And so that's where you start to see these threads come together between the DeVos's and the Kochs. But, a lot of this is philosophical window dressing for these people. At the end of the day, there's some very practical things that they make common cause over. The through line between the Christian nationalism of the DeVos family and the kind of education industry of the Koch family is deep antipathy to labor unions, if we're being very direct about it. I mean, at the end of the day, a lot of this comes down to just good old-fashioned opposition to unions, and public schools remain one of the more heavily unionized sectors of the country, and that's what a lot of this comes down to as well.
Which is why they were so thrilled with Scott Walker and the Republican Party there in Wisconsin,
Sure.
Right? When they were able to break apart everything there.
Right. So Walker famously signed bills about 14 years ago, rolling back substantial collective bargaining provisions. It moves that foreshadowed some of what happened here, although not to the same extent in our state. And a lot of that's been kind of reversed since the Democrats took over in our state. But you're right. I mean, Walker kind of made national headlines 14 years ago with direct and sustained attacks on teachers' unions in particular.
Doctor, in order for the money to flow from state governments to voucher schemes or school choice schemes, what have you, the voucher movement had to produce results, or they had to produce some studies showing that, hey, this is benefiting everybody, the students, the parents, the communities, the states. And they did so by producing studies showing, or at least they said showed, success of these programs. But you actually write about how these studies weren't exactly, quote unquote, studies showing successes. Can you talk about that in a little bit more detail?
Well, right. So the bigger and the larger the voucher system, the worse the results have been. And a lot of what you see today from the other side on this question, they'll cite credible research, but research that's now 20 to 25 years old. The last positive study of any sort of real quality showing vouchers helped academic outcomes as measured by test scores is 22 years old now. And the last study to show, again, of any sort of real quality to show that vouchers helped another measure like educational attainment is now 11 years old. So we're talking about really old stuff. And then since then, as these results have gotten more and more dreadful, as vouchers have expanded, and I can explain why that's happened too, if you'd like, but yeah, as they've gotten worse, they've been sort of surrounded by and packaged by studies and reports showing vouchers doing other things. Most notably, and I think most seriously, if we're going to take this argument seriously, there's some purported increases in parent satisfaction. I think it's really important. And I'm not sure the education community always does talk enough about parent satisfaction. And I want to be clear about that. How parents feel about their schools is an incredibly important measure. But put into the context of today's politics, the phrase parents' rights has a lot of loaded connotation. And what it particularly means, it's always been associated, as the American right wing has used it, with originally anti-integration, today with debates about gender, debates about who reads what book, where kids go to the bathroom in schools and things like that. Ken Starr, do you remember Ken Starr, the famous right-wing lawyer who went after Bill Clinton?
Of course.
Ken Starr actually was the chief attorney defending the voucher system in Cleveland that went to the Supreme Court in 2002. And from the steps of the Supreme Court after oral arguments in February of 2002, and I talk about this moment in the book, Starr was asked about mediocre academic results coming out of Cleveland, the program he just defended. And he said, it isn't really about that anyway. It's just as long as the parents are happy, that's fine. And it's been that way for a long time. The other side has really said, pay no attention to the test scores, just focus on other things. We could have that debate. My point has always been, we can have that debate. And God knows public school advocates and defenders have their own beef with using test scores to evaluate public schools.
True.
But my argument has been, as long as test scores are used to attack public schools for their performance, let's see how vouchers are doing on the same measure. And the answer is horrifically.
Right, because, in some states, and you can correct me if I'm wrong here, and please do, but, aren't there some states, or at least some cities or districts, where funding for public schools depends strictly on test scores?
Well, it's not that the funding depends on test scores, but test scores are certainly used as a package of ways to evaluate public schools and to assess them. And they, in the most extreme cases in the past, have been used to potentially shutter schools for poor academic quality as measured by test scores. That era in American education is starting to recede, I think, thankfully. But, even in our state, we have a number of schools across the state that are essentially under kind of a probationary period, and they have been for years because of their declining test scores. The Granholm administration actually signed bills that would have allowed for public schools in Michigan to be closed for poor academic performance. And there have been school closures in our state, not necessarily for low academic performance. You get into the weeds here, but it's certainly, how many times a year do you pull up news, straight line reporting? We're not even talking about ideological. And you see public school test scores blasted all over the front page, above the old crease in the paper versions. Detroit test scores are terrible, or Michigan kids have not made progress, or whatever. My argument here is all of that is far worse. And the evidence shows this very clearly. When you hold voucher schools accountable for the same test scores, they do far worse. The reason, sort of in nuts and bolts, the reason for this is that the idea of elite private schools, there are very many elite private schools out there. There are also very many elite public schools out there. But the typical private school to receive a voucher bailout from taxpayers is what I call subprime. They're financially distressed. They're not particularly good. Often they have open space because the families haven't wanted to pay to go there. They're barely hanging on. And so when states come in with voucher cash and send them to these schools, that's where kids get open seats, and the results show that. 70% of voucher users in other states have already been in private schools to begin with. So if we were to pass, if Michigan were to somehow overcome a constitutional hurdle here, or the Supreme Court, as voucher advocates want the Supreme Court to do, force vouchers on every state, if that were to happen here, 70% of users of Michigan's new voucher scheme would be already in Michigan private schools. The schools that have openings tend to be financially distressed subprime providers, and the test scores reflect that. They're not very good.
Wow. I remember a Detroit Free Press expose that was released around a decade ago, and I have kept that article for that long. And it was just detailing how Michigan taxpayers, shoveled $1 billion towards charter schools or private schools, what have you. But how it also fails to hold them accountable. And it was just a stark reminder, I think, for everybody on how this is such an abject failure for everyone, not just the students, but for the state. And reporter Jennifer Dixon wrote at the time how her research showed wasteful spending and double dipping board members, private school board members, school founders, and employees steering lucrative contracts or lucrative deals to themselves or insiders, schools allowed to operate for years despite poor academic records and no state standards for who operates charter schools or how to oversee them. So, Doctor, that's another part of this scheme. At least this is just one way for big money donors to find ways to enrich themselves at the cost of everybody else, especially those in the communities.
I don't really get into the wealth enrichment piece in my argument. That's not to say that it's not happening. My view is that when you're talking about the $1 billion folks, they don't need more money, and they don't, in this case, there's other more effective ways to line one's pockets. It's expensive to run schools, public or private. It's hard to run schools, public or private. The voucher movement, when it comes to the Betsy DeVosses of the world, the Kochs of the world, this is an ideological thing, first and foremost, that they're doing it because they want American society and American education to look this way. Now, that's not to say that once vouchers come in and scorch the public education landscape, there aren't others that come in after the fact and kind of, I see them as almost the education equivalent of like wartime profiteers that kind of come in after the fact and try to make some money on selling new apps to help find private schools, or selling, in some cases, we have these things called voucher third-party vendors that distribute vouchers on behalf of states, and they skim off the top. That would have happened in our state had the Betsy DeVos's voucher scheme passed a couple of years ago here. So there is a profit motive, but it's not held by the big movers and shakers of this. That's a much more of an ideological warfare piece than the profit piece. And that's, again, I don't mean to discount the other stuff, but the profit piece isn't really where I lay my focus. There's a bigger sort of ideological problem here that's going on, and that's the struggle right now.
No, I get completely what you're saying there. I recently talked about how private schools in Michigan are suddenly demanding that Michigan now spend money to give their student free meals after the state passed free meals for public school students. I imagine that you weren't so surprised by this sudden switch from private school advocates on this issue.
No, in fact, the universal school meals piece. Let me just start by saying that providing school meals to kids, regardless of income, is one of the strongest evidence-based education interventions we've seen in the academic literature over the last decade or so. So while we've seen all these horrific impacts that vouchers cause, it turns out that things like school meals have really strong positive effects, not just on kids' academic scores, but everything that we want, health, attendance, all kinds of things. So just setting that aside, these are really good things to do. The right wing in American politics is strongly opposed to universal meals in public schools. I have said in the last few months that the presidential election, as far as education is concerned, can really be thought of as a debate between universal school meals and universal school vouchers. On the other hand, we already talked about vouchers occupying Project 2025's central piece in education. The reason that the American right does not want school meals in public schools is ideological, just as I talked about the larger goal. They don't think public schools should be doing this, should be in this business. They think it's a church thing to be providing meals. They think it's a family thing to be providing meals. They're not against charity, but they want to run out of churches, and they see universal school meals in public schools as charity. But there's always a practical piece to all of this, right? So there's a lot of like hand-wringing, and you read some My World, you read these very sort of pretentious intellectual tomes about why government shouldn't be providing meals, and lots of name dropping and big syllabic words, multi-syllabic words. But at the end of the day, they really don't want universal school meals because it makes it harder to pass universal school vouchers, because private schools can't usually afford to give meals to kids. And it turns out parents really love it when meals are provided at school. And it's not just, by the way, good for parents and kids in schools. It's good for communities. Economists have shown that when school meals are implemented at a universal basis, grocery prices go down in the local communities, not surprisingly. Grocery prices go down, grocery bills go down. These are whole community solutions to lots of the problems that we're facing in the American economy. So that's why the right wing opposes these things. But at the end of the day, there's a very practical reason for it, and that's that they don't want private schools to be footing the bill. And if there are going to be public school meals, then yes, not surprising that the private schools want in on that too.
My last question here, if you could just maybe briefly talk about how, initially years ago, you were somewhat of a supporter of the school choice movement, and then you came to the realization of the scheme's failures. Was there a specific moment, Doctor, when you realized this, or was it through a series of events?
Yeah, a series of events. I mean, I don't want to flatter myself into thinking that sort of my opinion 20 years ago was particularly relevant. I was a program analyst and I was a policy analyst. And what that meant is I was supposed to go in with other teams and look at what types of programs were working and which weren't. And so, 20 years ago, you did have a couple of voucher systems that did seem to improve some academics for kids who use them. But over the last decade, again, the results have gotten horrific. And so I wrote my first piece, public writing, kind of concerned with vouchers, in a piece for the New Republic a decade ago, warning that as vouchers were beginning to expand, oversight over those programs was beginning to weaken. And you had states like Wisconsin, where I was working at the time, beginning to fund voucher schools that were teaching creationism and that correspondingly were scoring on the 5th percentile or below 95% of other schools on the state's STEM exams, math and science and so on. So as I was saying, you can't do this if these are going to be solutions for academic outcomes. I was writing that before the really big, horrible results for vouchers started to trickle out in places like Indiana, in places like Ohio, both border states for us, places like Louisiana. So anybody who was following the evidence should have, and I think did, follow the evidence away from vouchers as a solution to education inequality in this country at least 5 years ago, if not 10 years ago at this point. And what remains is just a right-wing ideological argument that vouchers are, they call it the civil rights issue of our time, somewhat perversely. It's an ideological case at this point that's all that's left to defend vouchers. And that's the debate we should be having instead of having the idea that vouchers, the argument that vouchers are any kind of solution to education outcome.
Dr. Josh Cowen, professor of education policy at Michigan State University and author of the new book called The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. Doctor, how can people get your book?
Well, it's available on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, bookshop.org, or it's also available at your local bookstore. If you're listening from Lansing, they have it at Hooked, and we had a book launch at Hooked just last week.
Outstanding. Well, thanks so much for coming back on to discuss this topic, Doctor, and thanks for highlighting the forces behind the school voucher scheme, a scheme that is one of the top priorities, as you said, in Project 2025. Good luck to you, and please come back again in the future.
I appreciate you having me always.
A podcast that believes in using common sense to move Michigan into the future. And by common sense, we mean progressive sense. We've all seen what 40 years of Republican leadership did to this state, and we refuse to go back. It's Left of Lansing with Pat Johnston. You can follow Pat on Facebook or X. Pat still calls it Twitter. Or on the Gram, Threads, and also on YouTube. Subscribe to the show on YouTube and wherever else you listen to your podcasts. All right, I think we gave Pat enough time to catch his breath. Let's get back to it. Here's Pat Johnston.
Yeah, please pick up Josh's book. It's an insightful and informational read into this school voucher scheme and how it's part of this right-wing billionaire ideological warfare against the people and our communities and our American values. And this week, Josh was quoted in a rather disturbing ProPublica piece on how the MAGA Republican majority in Ohio there passed a law providing millions and millions of dollars in the form of grant money to go towards renovations for religious schools, taxpayer money going right to religious schools. And according to the main architect of this Ohio law, its main purpose is to increase the capacity of private schools so that they can be ready for additional students. And as Josh said in the ProPublica article, this is new, dangerous ground funding new voucher schools. They're gaining ground in Ohio, which is why, everyone, we have to provide a blue wall of defense here in Michigan. And it's just another example of why keeping the State House blue and voting for Kira Harris Bolden and Kimberly Thomas on the state Supreme Court is as important as the presidential race. Don't forget that. Pick up Josh Cowen's book, The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. I will provide links on leftoflansing.com and wherever you're hearing this episode to pick up his book. Time now for a Left of Lansing last call. This is just a little something I like to get off my chest, but it's something I feel like many progressives, Democrats, independents, and non-MAGA voters alike have been dealing with for far too long, and that is MAGA Republican snowflake behavior. The other day, I was walking with a good friend who said that another mutual friend of ours had their Harris Walz sign stolen. Coincidentally, this friend later saw another sign stuffed in the bushes of another neighbor's house. When my friend asked their neighbor if they had their sign stolen because there was one in the bushes, he said no, but please prop it up a little higher in the bushes so that way people can see it. Oh, that was awesome. And it reminded me of the 2022 election season when we had our Governor Whitmer sign in our yard all crumpled up and tossed into the street. Naturally, to prove a point and my stubbornness, I smoothed out the sign as best as I could and I put it right back up. And then again, the sign was back in the street a few days later, to which again, I put the beat up sign back in my yard. Kind of like a badge of honor, you know? I wasn't going to back down to the bullying tactics of a MAGA clown, and I was going to let that snowflake know that no matter what they did, hate and hurt feelings would not win. I've read from others who've had similar stories, and it really makes me sad that some MAGA voters feel so threatened by a simple yard sign. I mean, if your candidate is so awesome, as he says he is, then it doesn't matter how many of his opponent's signs are up. I mean, he'll win because he knows big words, and he loves the uneducated. I saw a tweet by the Detroit News' Craig Mauger, who talked with some of dear leader Trump's supporters as they stood in line to see his little appearance there in Flint this week. And after talking with one woman, he tweeted the conversation, and this is what Craig said, and I'm quoting, "Spoke to a woman in line to get into Trump's town hall in Flint. She said she lost feeling in a finger because of how cold it was at Trump's rally in Waterford back in February. It never came back," she said. The woman said her name was Sue, but she wouldn't give her full name. Okay. So I find sadness. I mean, really, deep sadness in her story. I guess maybe she considers that a badge of honor, but she gave her finger basically for a guy who doesn't care about her one bit. And that behavior is what I call cultish behavior. And that's why they rip out campaign yard signs while putting up 20 signs of their dear leader's name and also a flag with his name on it in their yards. It's all about bullying. And they picked up his bullying tactics and they really believe it's all right. But you see, we can't back down. As Jody Decker, Democratic candidate for the 107th House District from Charlevoix all the way up to the Eastern UP, told us recently here on the podcast, listen.
I would say just don't be afraid to let your voice be heard. I'm a single mom. I was kind of worried in 22 about going out campaigning, leaving my kids at home, even though my one is 22 years old. But I was afraid to leave them home because I thought, well, what if something happens to them? Because my address is kind of public knowledge now. And I set up a few cameras and eased my own mind and went on with my business. So just don't be afraid to let your voice be heard.
Jody's right. Don't be afraid. Stand up for your beliefs against the bullying because, as we've seen, there's more of us than there are of them. And that's why we can defeat them at the ballot box in less than 2 months.
You're listening to the Left of Lansing podcast. The music you're hearing is by Wanderbeats. To hear the latest project, check out Space Leopard on your favorite streaming site. Now back to our favorite progressive voice in Michigan. It's Pat Johnston.
That's going to do it for this edition of The Left of Lansing. Again, you can always contact me, leftoflansing@gmail.com. Thanks one more time to Dr. Josh Cowen for talking about his book, The Privateers, How Billionaires Created a Culture War and Sold School Vouchers. And thanks to all of you who listen and subscribe. I love doing this for the common good and spreading the progressive message across Michigan and across the nation. And I can't do that without you. So thank you so very much. Oh, and a new Quinnipiac poll shows that Kamala Harris has a 5-point lead over Dear Leader Trump in Michigan, showing that Harris indeed got quite a boost from her outstanding debate performance last week. And that is great news. But look, we still got 6 weeks to go. And in politics, as many of you know, that's a lifetime. Still great news. And in other great news, as of this recording, the Detroit Tigers, your Detroit Tigers, are just a half game back of the final wildcard spot in the American League. I mean, everyone, this is an amazing late season charge by Tigers team we all wrote off in late July. Okay, don't say that you really had hope. No, I don't think any Tigers fan really had hope back in late July. Listen, it is nice to have the Tigers give us some hope and, quite frankly, a little escapism from everyday life. So go get them, Tigers. Until next time, take the battle to them. Thank you, Michigan.
The Left of Lansing podcast was produced by Pat Johnston, written by Pat Johnston, researched by Pat Johnston, edited by Pat Johnston, and hosted by, yes, Pat Johnston. Technical assistance by Dr. Heather. And thanks to our good friend Kirsten for the awesome podcast logo. Remember to visit leftoflansing.com for more news and information. Thanks again for listening to the Left of Lansing podcast.